Thank you very much, Melissa. I'm happy to be here because this is a opportunity just after the US elections. Syrians have been told over the last year at least that they should wait until after the elections in November, whether Barack Obama would be re-elected or a change would come, but there would be a change of policy. In this conference, I note, and you will note, as I did, that the only session that does not carry in its title the word human rights is this one. And that only indicates how the human rights dimension was engulfed very quickly by the geopolitical issues and considerations. And the world has certainly failed to address the human rights issue, including the humanitarian issue, and much less the democratic aspirations. The cost of upholding human rights was too high, and there were ongoing attempts to get the regime to agree to stop the killing, to get the Russians to press the regime, and to get the opposition to lower its ceiling. The regime never showed any intention of dealing with the opposition's demands with a political response, and the opposition that tried to take a compromising attitude was discredited. I must say, Syrians at some point stopped moaning about human rights, and they called for quite a long time for the protection of civilians. For the last year and a half, they have been calling for a no-fly zone, for some form of humanitarian protection, for humanitarian corridors. They examined the issues of truce periods, hours of truce in a day where the ICRC, the Red Cross, was suggesting in order to get some humanitarian aid in. None of this worked. The message was and remains, there won't be any of that. The mistake was probably to believe that this is a human rights issue only, that is certainly awful, but that could be delayed, left to simmer, and that attrition would eventually lead to a mutually hurting stalemate that would bring the government and the forces of the revolution to accept a compromise. But that is not what has happened and is happening. What is happening is that there are forces that are more determined on both sides to interfere and provide the needed means to fight a battle. And the democratic groups on the ground are just as determined, but they receive no support, no aid, and are becoming the weakest party. So the war that could be won if the democratic forces are left without means is the war of Sunnism against Shiism. It is the wrong battle and would certainly be the wrong victory, because it is the most dangerous one for the integrity of Syria as a nation state. We've lived with contradictions over the year and a half and 20 months now, so soon 21. Some of these contradictions are to call for unity of the opposition and then complain about the importance and the influence of the Islamists within this coalition. Another contradiction is not providing the needed means for Syrians to protect themselves and then complain about the sources that are providing those means, the Islamists, the Salafis, the extremists, and complaining about them to the opposition itself. Another contradiction is saying that Syria's geopolitics are too sensitive to give priority to human rights, and then say, well, it's too bad for Syrians if Syria is collapsing, because its collapse will damage Syria alone. And everyone knows that it will not damage Syria alone. Turkey is asking for help and for action. the Gulf countries have been asking for action. They know it will come back to bite them if Assad remains, if the country slips into chaos. Vital interests of the West are at stake in the region. And I will not bring in here and deliberately the discussion about whether the security of all states in the region, including Israel, is addressed at the very moment with the lack of action. The Christians and groups that probably the West cares for, perhaps more than others, are asking for decisive action. What should the US do? First of all, a political coalition has emerged recently. It emerged in about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago in Doha, early November. I think it is extremely important to recognize it unconditionally first as a political move and consider it a full partner. You can consider it a partner that you deal with by engaging and putting benchmarks, asking for certain conditions, for providing support. But recognition as a political move is absolutely necessary because this is consistent with the need for an alternative representative for the Syrian people. Syria, as you know, is not represented at the moment anywhere, in any country, in any international organization, because the regime's representatives are not accepted as legitimate by the large majority of the international community. It is important to trust this coalition. It has emerged with some efforts. It would always need to balance its decisions against the balance inside the coalition, but that is the nature of a diverse coalition that brings together different groups from all the spectrum of Syrian society. And I say society, not just the opposition or the revolutionary groups. It can be concretely trusted with support, with some support, and that support can be increased afterwards once the mechanisms are established. It is important to help it develop its mechanisms for transparency and fair distribution. All of this can come through engagement. But standing on the side and putting conditions before recognizing such a coalition, I think, is one way of weakening it and probably allowing divisions to reemerge and allowing, more importantly, the regime to continue manipulating some groups. You must always know that in a terror, in a dictatorship such as this one, any group is infiltrated by the regime, whether they are political or military on the ground. Very often, and this was said early on by the regime, they said we use the systematic technique of infiltrating all groups. There is a model, a precedent for that, and that was Algeria back in the 90s. The regime in Algeria, what was called the military security, in fact infiltrated all the Islamist groups to the point that you could not tell when attacks were conducted and massacres were committed against the population who exactly had committed those atrocities. So we have to be wary of that and consolidate that group and empower it in order for it to really begin moving forward. It is not enough to recognize it politically, diplomatically. It is necessary also to give it the legal strength and the legal power for it to be able to establish a fund for the Syrian people, to claim the assets of the Syrian regime, who are now the people who are under sanctions, people and organizations and firms and institutions, and ministries. All of this is dependent on a full recognition of the opposition, the current coalition. In humanitarian aid, we see that the people on the ground are waiting desperately for humanitarian aid. And ironically, we note that over the last period, over the last maybe 3 or 4 months, military aid is reaching the groups on the ground more effectively than humanitarian aid, because it is well organized by those countries that are providing military aid. Now, I'll come to what kind of military aid in a minute, but just to say that people are desperate for humanitarian aid, and the humanitarian aid itself is desperately needed by the military groups themselves to distribute to the population, because the embeddedness of the Free Syrian Army is obviously its strength. It needs to have the backing of the social community, of the community in which it is fighting. And these civilians are paying a very heavy price for the presence of the Free Syrian Army. And those military groups know that they become resented by the civilians because it attracts the regime's attacks on villages and towns and the destructions that come because of those fights. The humanitarian aid, therefore, becomes a vital component of the resistance against the regime. And these groups, we have noted, are asking now for humanitarian aid more desperately than they ask for arms. So this indicates that humanitarian aid will not go for arms. That's one first consideration. International organizations go on saying, how do we know that the money will not go to the armed groups for buying arms? Another fear has been it's going to go to benefit the Islamists. Well, the best way to avoid that is to channel those funds through a coalition that has a mechanism that does not, that distributes in a very balanced way the humanitarian aid. We did not succeed so far in having humanitarian aid distributed equally to all groups, irrespective of their affiliations. But we know that Islamist groups have been very generous. They come in, they fund mostly groups that they believe will be loyal to them or whose loyalty can be bought. So it is important to note that humanitarian aid is a highly political, in the noble sense of politics, not in the sense of partisan politics, but that you can really have impact through humanitarian aid. I think that standing on the sidelines has been the most self-defeating attitude that we have seen from many countries who could have supported the democratic groups on the ground. Watching and putting conditions, then deciding whether you want to move forward. Whoever is intervening in Syria now is able to affect the outcome. And that is a very major consideration. What you invest today in Syria is what you find at the end of this war, of this battle. Because the situation is in flux with a very high propensity for being shaped by whoever is willing to deploy the right means. There is therefore an urgent need to be aggressive in supporting democratic groups on the ground and empowering them. The money that comes from fundamentalist Islamic sources is distributed with only a condition of loyalty, not of any accountability. The others, the democratic forces, are crying for support, and what you see most often is that they are asked to prove that they are real Democrats, that they have no Islamist inclinations, that they will manage whatever they received in a transparent way, that they will... all of these conditions have resulted in groups coming in with no conditions, funding massively, and the democratic groups not receiving the support that they should receive. I think it is very possible to choose the groups with which the US and Western countries want to work. And it's actually not only Western countries. Some of the Arab countries are very keen on supporting those democratic groups. To choose those, to identify them, and to channel the aid through them, whether it's political, whether it is humanitarian or military, is very important. I think protecting minorities in Syria today will happen best by empowering the democratic and liberal groups right now, and they have been asking for that for many months now. The best option to protect minorities is to do everything to strengthen those democratic groups now, those who are committed to protecting diversity. The US will not have credibility and influence if it does not provide the decisive support for the revolution to tilt the balance of forces on the ground. And in fact, if it does not provide that support, if that balance of forces is not tilted in favor of the opposition, it will have no credibility either in the eyes of Russia and China. And I strongly believe that the deadlock in discussions with the Russians, and to a lesser extent the Chinese, is because the lack of determination in supporting one side and supporting the opposition and allowing it to prevail is why we have this ongoing deadlock. There is a need for a dual strategy, one that upholds the need for unity, continue to support unity of the opposition, while supporting the groups you want to see emerge on the ground. The US needs to do both, just like the Islamists, in fact, were doing. They coordinate on a certain level while they strengthen their own groups on the ground. And doing that while strengthening democratic groups is perfectly feasible and I think legitimate and necessary. They need the financial support, they need the military support and the decisive military support in order to, and they also need a sense of direction. And that is why the connection between the coalition now and the military groups on the ground is one, again, that does not need to be tested whether it is functioning. It is by empowering the coalition and saying everything will be channeled through this coalition that the connection will be strong and effective. And then one can hold the coalition responsible, accountable, and have it as an interlocutor instead of dealing with military groups only. No precedent shows that dealing with military groups only leads to a stable polity in and a stable political system. Another dual strategy that is needed is to support the military efforts, again, as I said, decisively, while actively seeking a political solution. The Russians will understand and are more likely to change when they see the balance of forces changing. They have no moral considerations that will make them change their position. It is not because we have another 50,000 dead that Russia will change its position. It understands the crude balance of forces, and I think that is what will change its position. These were the words of a Syrian former diplomat who said, change the balance of forces on the ground and go and talk to the Russians. And I think that really summarized very, very well how Russia understands what goes on inside Syria. A political solution, there are those who believe that the military means will provide the solution. The truth is that nothing over the last 20 months has altered the dynamics of terror and destruction that the regime has spread. The extremists have a much stronger voice. The dangerous lesson that some are conveniently drawing now is that it takes the extremist groups to get rid of a regime like Assad. There is still a short window during which this decision will remain relevant, but it will become irrelevant in a not too distant future. So, as we know, the groups on the ground have seized depots of armaments from the regime. They are using them now, and the absence of those and these are not sufficient, but the absence of such types of armaments, which are decisive even for humanitarian aid today, is I think, where there is a big weakness, and a weakness for the future. Finally, we need a responsible management by the international community of the Syrian crisis after Assad, as we have clearly not succeeded in having one during the conflict. Syria is a key nerve in the regional security system. It will be very vulnerable to all sorts of evil plans, secessionist groups, colluding with remnants of the regime, determined extremists who can commit a massacre, and 1 or 2 massacres are sufficient to spread fear and terror, and bring some communities to want to be separated. And Islamists who are already saying that they paid a high price, a higher price than other groups, should have a larger share of power. If we want to prevent all of this, I don't think any government, however balanced and coherent, will be able to prevent any of that. It will have to deal with an emergency humanitarian situation, destructions, and that is what it, and of course setting up the institutions of the new state, of the new political system. Therefore, I think we will be in need of outside help, and in need probably of a peacekeeping force. We have heard the special envoy to Syria, Mr. Brahimi, say that there should be a UN peacekeeping force, but I think what should be made clear that such a peacekeeping force is not about establishing a ceasefire and stability with Assad still in power. It is about the post-Assad era. It will not help if we have it as a tool now, and deploying it, I don't think, will lead anywhere. It may be, we need that peacekeeping force with a broad mandate, and we need to work on it now, because it takes a good 6 months to put it together. It may be possible to secure at least minimal cooperation from Russia under the broad objective of stabilizing Syria without speaking of Assad or post-Assad. Only this will need to be prepared as a post-Assad plan. And the change of balance of forces on the ground is the only way to get this cooperation, I think, from all the countries that are reluctant. We need to change. All of the players on the ground will be rational. Some of them may find it interesting to be to create chaos on the ground, but these are a minority. Is it in the interest of Iran to create chaos in Syria? Well, that's a good reason not to allow that. Is it in the interest of Hezbollah in Lebanon to create chaos? I'm not sure. I think Hezbollah will review its own calculations and want to play its role and perhaps take some distance. Is it in the interest of Russia? I don't think so. And I think this is where we will get the cooperation of Russia on a plan of this sort once there is a show of determination. I will stop at that for a short period for discussion, right?
Yes. Well, first. Thank you. Have a seat here.
Oh, right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kodmani. It was a tour de force and really important for us in our thinking here about what the United States can do. And now I think we have a few minutes for question and answer, and I know that that comprehensive presentation will provoke some questions. So turn it over to you all. Be bold. I see one back here.
Thank you, Dr. Kodmani. My name is Kristen Broker. I work for the Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights. I had a question based on the composition of the new council representing the coalition that you were speaking of. My understanding is that it's got about 40 members, but none are women. Can you, I guess, speak about whether this is a concern for you and what you think the best way for NGOs and countries that are concerned to promote women's rights in whatever happens in Syria, assuming that there is a transition?
It's a major issue, and as you can imagine, it is of very high concern for me and for Syrian women. Some of them are sitting here and are very active on this. Rafif Shwijati is one of those very, very active women. We need a strategy to promote women's participation in public life, in the media, in the institutions. The coalition that came together is of 64 members. 3 women are part of it. There are rumors that there's a 4th one. So that obviously is ridiculously insufficient. But we are going, there's a long way to go in the sense that we had women played a prominent role. They are educated. They were extremely active in the beginning of the revolution, and they still are very active, but not very visible. The challenge is whether they will be able to play a role in the coming period, and this is where there is mobilization now to really develop strategies for promoting women's participation. We need the experience of other countries. We know that women have a special role in reconciliation in many divided and war-torn societies. So it's not only about equality, it's also their ability to play that kind of role. So these are all very nice words, and we know all of these things. How do we make this a reality? I think it's a long-term battle, but I think it has clearly started, and women are mobilized for this period. Humanitarian aid, for example, is the work of women mostly, but for the future, the strategies are now being put in place. Hopefully, they will be implemented.
Thank you. Way back here.
Thank you, Dr. Kodmani. My name is Kareem Shore. I'm a pro-democracy Syrian American. Could you please comment on the recent news relating to the alleged potential use of chemical weapons, and what that, given the Obama administration's stated position on the quote-unquote red line, what that means to the coalition, to the opposition, and what kind of reaction you're hearing on the ground from Syria, from those who are opposed to the regime. I have anecdotal examples demonstrating that even those who are against the regime are now at a point where they are also against international military intervention based on the chemical weapons red line issue. Can you give us more of sort of better insight into that topic?
Well, it's really how we evaluate and how we analyze the regime's psyche and how it will behave. The indications we have are alarming, because those who have defected, whether they are from the military or from the government, senior defectors are saying, yes, there is discussion of the use of chemical weapons. And this is not related to international intervention. So my fear is that international intervention is not coming anyway. The regime can interpret international intervention as the provision of weapons. And therefore, it already is happening, if you want to follow that logic. I think the risk is high. I won't repeat what Senator McCain said. That was the first reaction of Syrians. Does it take chemical weapons, the use of chemical weapons, for the international community to react? Well, are we close to that point? I think there is a serious risk. I do think the regime needs to hear very strong and clear warnings of the sort that we have heard now. They are effective now. They were not back in July. It seemed irrelevant, and it seemed even outrageous to speak of them as the threshold. The threshold was so high. But now it has become a reality and a possible risk. And in this case, I think that is what needs to be discussed with those countries that are still supporting the regime. Russia and China cannot, I think. I think they will have to reconsider their position if that became a serious, an imminent threat.
Here we go, right here in front.
Thank you very much. My name is Doki Fasihi, and I'm an independent human rights advocate. You spoke a little bit about changing the balance on the ground and decisive military action in Syria from the United States and Western powers. I wonder what your views are on what is needed for that to take place. Do you think that the United States can work with its NATO partners to change the balance on the ground without the support of other emerging powers like Brazil and South Africa and India, who've basically shown that they're not very supportive of this? Do you think that's wise to do, or do you think that the U.S. should be doing more to build support among those players? Thank you.
Well, there are two possible tracks to take. One is the UN, and that led to a deadlock. There was no way to get any resolution out of the UN Security Council, and even a political plan which emerged from Geneva at the end of June was not adopted by the Security Council. Therefore, there is that path doesn't lead anywhere and is not leading anywhere. But the other one is the Friends of Syria. And among the Friends of Syria, the group of NATO countries, that is a different one. And you do not need the approval of those countries that are within the UN because the UN is blocked. Now, there is a possibility, an easy and a low-cost possibility of establishing a no-fly zone. And frankly, we still need to hear a convincing argument about why it is not possible to establish a no-fly zone. Because without intervention, you've heard John McCain today, we've seen experts writing about it, you do not need to have any intervention, in fact, nor destruction of the air defense systems of the Syrian regime, not a Libya-type operation, just declaring a no-fly zone from Turkish territory, and the range of the missiles, of the Patriot missiles, is enough to say it covers all of the liberated areas. In addition to that, there is a need for anti-aircraft systems. One of the participants from Syria who was coming out to the Friends of Syria meeting in July in Paris said, anti-aircraft missiles are humanitarian aid to us today. That's what they are, because we cannot even get people to go back to their towns and to their houses. So you have 500,000 who leaves in 48 hours. They can never come back because of the shelling from the air. So, and the territory is being liberated at a very, very high cost in terms of sacrifices, but this cannot be protected. So we are living in a really absurd situation where nothing can be repaired, no population can go back to their places, no aid can be distributed properly, no medical support. All of this is at the mercy of what falls from the sky by the regime's air force. So it's anti-aircraft systems, defense systems, that are currently the only way of protecting and in fact creating a de facto no-fly zone by Syrians themselves.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matar Ibrahim. I was listening to one of the opposition figure. His name is Haytham Manna. He refuses to join the opposition coalition. His proposal is to go for forcing solution from outside instead of solution by force and intervention. How feasible such solutions are, and how popularity such solutions have in the situation currently? And is there a chance for a solution in Syria if the Iranians and the Saudis refuse to sit together and to think about certain compromises in the situation there?
I think the best option for Syria is to try and shield it from the regional players. We want a Syrian solution for Syria. It doesn't have to be this Saudi and Iranian and regional powers rivalries that are played out in Syria. What we need is obviously for the attempts have been made to reach a political solution. If that is not possible, what I was describing seems to me the only way you can convince the countries that cover the regime diplomatically. Without Russian support and Chinese support, we would not have the situation we have today. And the people on the ground who feel completely abandoned and lonely this is unprecedented in the sense that if you do not create a situation on the ground that says, with or without your condemnation and diplomatic efforts and responsible behavior at the level of the UN Security Council, things are changing on the ground. Unfortunately, this is where we are. Unfortunately, we had to go for military confrontation because the regime did everything to drag the opposition towards military confrontation. And the moment it becomes militarized, it becomes dependent on outside support. And this is where we are today. And I'm saying this outside support has also different colors. It can come from conservative sources that promote an Islamist, fundamentalist, conservative agenda, and I think this is dangerous for Syria. And there are other sources that can promote democratic groups, and they're not coming. And that really is where we have an imbalance in this fight. But it is by changing that balance of the forces on the ground that you can hope for, hopefully not a full military solution. Because a full military solution, if Assad is killed violently, unfortunately, many people think he will only go violently. But if he goes by being killed, my fear is that violence will continue. This is why we have to play the game of reaching a point where there's no other solution but for him to go. But that operation needs to be a controlled process, not one the way Gaddafi was taken out and killed.
I saw another one right over here. We have time for one or two more quick questions.
Hi, I'm Eric Eggleston from the Holocaust Museum, and I want to thank you for a very interesting presentation. And one of the aspects that you brought out very well was thinking about what we can do now to affect the post-Assad period when hopefully it comes. And one of the issues that's been raised is the risks that might be to minority groups and others that stood by Assad in the post-Assad period, perhaps like the Alawite community that stood with him, portions of it that stood with him. So what are the things we can do now, the U.S. government and others, to start preventing these sort of atrocities should they happen?
I think I made 2 points in my presentation, which in fact somehow answer your question indirectly. One is, it is not enough to ask for symbolic representation of minorities in a political coalition. There's a fight going on the ground. People are all armed, and it's not going to be enough to reassure any minority, not the Alawites. The Christians have nothing to fear in terms of for their physical security. They might feel uncomfortable in a future Syria if it is dominated by some form of Islamist groups, but there's no physical risk for them. There is a physical risk because 1% or 0.5% of determined groups on the ground can decide that they should go out and kill and commit a massacre in an Alawite village or elsewhere. So Syrians will all say, we've always lived together peacefully and we want to live together peacefully again. But we have that risk. To avoid that risk, I think we need, as I said, promote the democratic groups and make sure that they can have a strong say in the future. Because if you look at numbers in Syria, it's almost impossible to have an Islamist regime. At least 50% will naturally not vote for Islamic groups. So we have a configuration that really needs to be preserved. But the revolution, because the money comes from Islamic sources, will try to impose more influence of these groups. The second was the UN Peacekeeping Force. I think if we want to build a democratic Syria smoothly, it will never be a smooth transition. But if we want to prevent the worst, if we want to prevent the partition of the country, the warlords, the chaos, the extremist groups spreading and taking Syria as their haven, I think all of this requires international aid and a responsible decision to put together a UN peacekeeping force.
Okay, I'm getting the high sign. I think we're out of time. I want to thank you, Dr. Kodmani, for an incredibly important and timely conversation.